shipped by river to Odessa and resold for export. Morning tea, a grim affair in this household, is punctuated by talk of business. Nearly all talk in this house is of business. The children, among them Yosef Vladimirovich, born in 1866, later a leader of the Cadets, the Russian Liberal Party, whose memoirs provide us with this glimpse of life at the Gessens, escape this talk to play in the courtyard until their father gathers them in his carriage for a ride to school. Gessen remembers riding down streets packed with grain vendors, calling to his father, some stopping the carriage and talking rapidly, insistently, in the Jewish jargon, a language his father spoke, although the children didn't, nor could they understand it. Hebrew they were taught, but it never made much sense to them. There were no books at home, except school texts, prayer books, and interestingly, the pamphlets produced, quote, by a poor, slightly mad relative, end quote, of their mother's. This man, quote, was constantly publishing, although he was poor as a church mouse. All the money he collected for the pamphlets, which he peddled himself, he used to publish new ones. What his daily bread was, nobody knew, and he didn't seem to need any, end quote. Jewish books in this house were in effect consigned to madmen. We'll soon return to this theme. By no means was this a Jewishly indifferent family, not by Odessa standards. Father was an officer of Odessa's great synagogue. The family carefully cleared away all bread items as stipulated by Jewish ritual from their home prior to the Passover festival, and they fasted on the Day of Atonement. Still, by the time young Gessen entered university, many of his family's social circle had converted to Christianity. There was something tedious about Jewish ritual, he felt, as a youth. In fact, the only moments of true passion he recalled was the terror that gripped his family over the prospect of economic catastrophe during the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-78, when the outlet from the Black Sea was closed and grain shipments disrupted. All that truly mattered was business. Jewish life was tepid, dry, unmeaningful. Gessen writes, I quote, "Even in my time, all these religious traditions began to fade. The little prayer scrolls were no longer hung upon the door frames to protect homes from ill fortune. The touching and exciting reminiscences of the 1,000-year-long road of suffering became a dry conventionality, a tedious duty which one had to observe. Once it began, the assimilation of Russian culture progressed with giant strides," end quote. Books as playthings, the stuff of eccentrics or worse, a life circumscribed by the heavy demands of business, especially grain. Quote, "Commercial history of Odessa is the history of Odessa," end quote, wrote the distinguished 19th century local historian Skalkovsky. One could begin, quite credibly, a cultural history of Jewish Odessa at the Gessen's breakfast table. Follow the family into the streets, down Richelievskaya, to work, rarely to play, to cafe, sporadically, listlessly to synagogue. The materialism and the unusual opportunities available to Jews, the majority of the major grain exporters in Odessa, Russia's main grain exporting port, by mid-century were Jews, influenced here mobility, ritual laxity, and acculturation. The presence in the city from its earliest days, it was founded in 1794, of cultural institutions that pulled at Jews, a splendid opera house, theater, etc., who were at the same time less constrained than in most other large Jewish cities in Eastern Europe because of Odessa's geographical remoteness from the centers of traditional Jewish culture. All these had their impact in the shaping of an unusual community. According to some estimates, by the 1870s, 90% of the city's Jewish-owned shops were open on the Sabbath. Hence the Yiddish saying, quote, 7 miles around Odessa during the fires of hell. A credible alternative to embarking on a cultural excursion of Jewish Odessa from the home of a well-situated grain merchant is to start at the workplace of a Jewish sales clerk. The city counted about 26,000 such clerks in 1905, the vast majority of them Jews. Most were economically marginal women and men. They were compelled to dress well, which meant that many female sales clerks found themselves resorting to prostitution to supplement very meager incomes. Their hours of employment were unregulated by the state, in contrast to factory workers, for instance, who could be made to work no more than 11 and a half hours daily. Even when customers were not in the store, sale clerks were generally made to stand. The fate of such white-handed workers, the Russian term for white-collar, non-manual laborers, represented a rich part of urban folklore. Looking closely at them might help us rethink conflicting meanings of secularity, success, failure, health, as well as disease. They were, of course, immortalized by Isaac Babel. He has, as you may recall, one of gangster Benya Creek's men accidentally killed a Jewish clerk, Yosef Rubenstein, and Benya dictates in one of Babel's so-called Odessa tales the terms of an absurdly lavish funeral, where the gangster himself delivers the oration. Quote, "Gentlemen and ladies, what did our dear Yosef get out of life? A couple of trifles. What was his occupation? He counted other people's money. There are people already doomed to die, and there are people who haven't begun to live," end quote. Clearly, a cultural history of Jewish Odessa that overlooks the nexus between economics and acculturation is inadequate, as I have appreciated for several years since this city first captured my attention. Odessa's grain casino, the center of local grain trade, was arguably a Jewish space, comparable on its own terms to the Vilna Shulhal, that central courtyard in the old Jewish section of the Jerusalem of Lithuania, in how it provided a spatial framework for communal coordination, informal chat, as well as economic exchange. Only the most rigid would insist that Jewish life in Odessa must be understood with the same tools as older, more Jewishly stable and traditional settings like Vilna. Vilna, one of the very few unsullied positive images to emerge in the culturally fractious world of late 19th century East European Jewry. In Hasidic circles, of course, Vilna remained throughout the 19th century a source of misgiving as an influential anti-Hasidic stronghold. Elsewhere, though, it was roundly celebrated as an emblem, both of rabbinic learning and modern Jewish scholarship, a place of study houses, streets informally named after biblical sites, distinguished book publishers, a city where even simple Jews spoke, or so it was often claimed, a language replete with midrashic allusion. This, in contrast to Odessa, was said to be a good place, appropriately depending on one's priorities, learned, pious, politically active, communally cohesive. An indication of this standing is Shmuel Yosef Finn's Kiryanem Ana, a history of Vilna published in 1860, the first history written of a Russian Jewish community, and indeed one of the very first historical compositions written by a Russian Jew. Quote, "A prayer in every stone, a chant, a melody in every wall," as the poet Moshe Stroum would later write of Vilna. In contrast then to boisterous Odessa, that unsettled city of newcomers, Vilna's Jewish population at the end of the 19th century stood at about 60,000, 100,000 fewer than in Odessa, and in Vilna 40% of the population, tightly organized, communally cohesive, a city of 12,000 Jewish families that, or so we've been told, counted itself in families, not separate souls. I mention all this to underline the importance of beginnings. How for a historian, no less than for a writer of fiction like Aristotle, the way one begins a narrative determines something, at times a good deal, of how it is told. In telling the story of a city, it should be self-evident that this can be done in numerous ways, depending, again, at least in part, on where one starts. This has little bearing necessarily on accuracy. The sources one uses must be interpreted accurately, of course, but it is the historian's choice to decide which to utilize, and such choices have a decisive impact on the texture and the trajectory of one's narrative. Choice of one set of sources or narrative strategy over another is the product of calculations of historical priority, transparency, and significance. All of these are, in large and small ways, influenced by individual predilection, a myriad of subjective factors and inclinations that the historian can't always be aware of. Philosopher Stuart Hampshire puts these rather self-evident truisms well with an interesting twist at the end, and I reflected on his shrewd observation while writing this lecture. I quote, "The significance of a writer, whether poet or philosopher or historian, and that which makes him worthy of study now, commonly does not reside principally in the conscious intention behind his work, but rather in the precise nature, as we now see it, of the conflicts and the imaginative inconsistencies in his work," end quote. In this vein, I interrogate my abiding fascination with Odessa. I construct this lecture around texts that help me determine how to start the telling of its story. My relationship with these texts, mostly Maskilik, or Jewish Enlightenment in nature, has long been complicated, usually adversarial, as I have understood it, in that I have found them useful for their social and cultural evidence, and nearly always problematic in their assumptions about the city, and, as most of them asserted, its cultural deficiencies. To understand what I mean, and my predicament, at least in this respect, can be seen as something of a microcosm for that of the writer of Russian Jewish history until the opening of archival material in the former USSR in the last three or 4 years. You must bear in mind that those of us who write about the Russian Jewish past have for much of the century been dependent mostly on printed sources. Printed sources located almost entirely in the West. Archival research in the Soviet Union was closed to Judaic scholars, and the bulk of material available, the sort of material on which my own history of Odessa was built, is almost exclusively in the form of press, newspapers and journals, Jewish and non-Jewish. Fortunately, there was a vast periodical press in Imperial Russia, with Jewish newspapers in a range of languages, Russian, Hebrew, and Yiddish. Still, articles in this press were skewed in rather predictable ways, and as printed sources were sometimes heavily censored or self-censored, and nearly all produced by intellectuals of one sort or another. The intellectuals and so-called half-intellectuals, a wonderful Russian term, responsible for writing this material, nearly always, as it happens, viewed Odessa in much the way that 20th century intellectuals have tended to view Los Angeles. Vapid, flamboyant, mercenary, all too enticing. Exceptions are rare, and also self-conscious about how they break the mold. Isaac Babel is one. Vladimir Jabotinsky, who wrote that rare celebration of Jewish businessmen in Odessa, is another. In any event, the primary source base on Odessa Jewry, until the opening of Russian and Ukrainian archives, in the last few years were the numerous articles written in newspapers and journals by writers who, on the whole, loathed or at least patronized the city. Imagine a history of Los Angeles, written without access to local archives, and guided mainly by the dark ruminations on LA of Bertolt Brecht or Nathaniel West. I exaggerate, but not wildly. Quote, "The least historical of all cities," end quote, said historian Simon Dubnov, the dean of Russian Jewish historiography, about Odessa. And he lived here for his most fertile years, the most fertile years of a scholarly and publicistic life between 1890 and 1903. The city, insisted Dubnov, essentially had no history. And what it did have was wrong, crass, commercial, brash, and irrelevant. Such judgments were, as I insisted when I wrote my first book, misleading historically. If it was commerce that had a decisive impact on local culture, with the demands of commerce fueling transparently the building of the famed Odessa Opera House, local museums, etc., this should be analyzed, not excoriated. I revisit here two memoirs and one Hebrew novel. And all of these hold the city accountable for failing in one way or another to live up to hegemonic, abstract standards based mostly on Vilna as an urban exemplar. What I find surprising in rereading them after several years is how sympathetic I find them. To the extent to which I concur, and probably always concur, with at least some of their more important assumptions about Odessa. These assumptions are, I understand, rigid, probably excessively so. They assume a preference for a bookish, literate culture, and view boisterous, materialistic Odessa from the margins, from the vantage point of intellectuals who, when thinking about the place, are rendered glum, envious, scandalized, outside in the cold. This is, as I now realize, uncannily similar to my own thinking about the place. And ironically, it is for this reason that I have long remained fixated on the city as a cultural signpost in contemporary Jewish life. First, a sketch by Elchanan Levinsky, an Odessa Hebraist of note, a member of the entourage of the Jewish nationalist cultural leader Haram. In 1896, he reflects on what might be called the wages of cultural space in Jewish Odessa, in a city called City of Light. He begins by telling how he finds himself passing sometimes with sadness a building on Langeron Street, now a bustling cafe, where a few years ago there was located a reading room. Here, for a mere 5 kopecks, a reader could sit all day with the world's best literature. The room was nearly always empty. When he queried its owner as to why, Levinsky was then a newcomer to Odessa, in a city full of, quote, men of enlightenment and readers of books, end quote, it couldn't attract more readers. The proprietor answered with what now seemed to Levinsky an uncanny prescience. He said that if he opened a cafe, it would be packed. Odessa Jews enjoy, as he put it, boisterous activity, rich food, harsh coffees, never works. Even when a couple of poor Jews meet on the street, the information they exchange is about the current price of a ruble. Hence, the city's cultural institutions, impressive from afar, languish from neglect. Levinsky continues, still musing on the now thriving cafe, how the same remoteness from learning and high culture leave their stamp on local Jewish life. Judaism here is a spectator sport, a passive exercise in curiosity, quaint, even kitsch. This is what he describes when he brings us to the city park, to a city park, in the early evening with its minstrels and other delights. Here there is a Jewish minstrel named Avinu, who sings ditties he calls the songs of the Jews. He tells stories from the lives of the Jews, and he dances Jewish dances. On stage, surrounded kosher Jews just like him. The crowd loves him. They, Jews and non-Jews alike, cry for more, begging him to tell them more stories from the Jewish past. The Jews of Odessa, Levinsky writes, are the first to pay good money for the sheer pleasure, as he puts it, of having dirty water tossed in their faces. Predictably, Levinsky, a native of Lithuania, compares these odd, troubling features of life to conditions back home, and in comparison, the Black Sea port comes out looking awful. My second proof text is an appraisal of Mendel and Mochus in turn-of-the-century Odessa. Now, by then, Mendel had achieved, as is well known, an extraordinary standing in East European Jewry, as its greatest writer of Hebrew as well as Yiddish prose. The best proof of the stature and popularity is his lecture tour of 1909 that took him throughout the East European region, the grandest tour of a Jewish writer of the time. Even the sardonic David Frischman, Frischman is probably the most dour Jewish literary critic of the time. Even Frischman observed that no Jewish writer had before encountered such a reception. Here is Frischman on the tour. And I quote, "The triumphal tour went from Vilna to Bialystok, from Bialystok to Warsaw, from Warsaw to Łódź. No other writer, Jew or Gentile, has ever been accorded such an honor. It was the journey of a duke. Thousands of people waited at each train station. Thousands of people jostled and pushed each other to approach him, happy if they managed to shake his hand or even just catch a glimpse of his face," end quote. Now, presumably, in Mendel's hometown, Odessa, he had lived here since 1880, where he was director of a local educationally innovative Talmud Torah. He was treated similarly. This is what the writer Yitzhak Berkovich, the son-in-law of Sholem Aleichem, assumed, and he writes as a newcomer to Odessa with surprise of Mendel's local standing. He finds in Odessa that Mendel wanders the city streets for hours without being recognized. This is how he gathered much of the material he used in his fiction, spying on conversations, which he could do efficiently because, though lionized elsewhere, he walked Odessa's streets relatively unnoticed. Perhaps Berkovich exaggerates. His sense, though, of Mendel's predicament, which, as it happens, is how Mendel, too, saw the situation, remains revealing. Berkovich writes, and I quote, "Mendel would go walk around in Odessa, and there were very few people of the local population who knew that he was the old honored man. And if there was someone who happened to remark that this was Mendel, the news would seem entirely strange. Mendel? Who is Mendel? A Hasidic Rebbe? A good pious Jew? A wonder worker? What is this sort of person doing in Odessa?" I'll return to what I think this means in a moment. My final example, this one more lengthy, is, among other things, further testimony to how firmly Vilna had imposed itself on the Jewish cultural imagination, defining in the process what responsible, credible cultural change was and what it wasn't. I refer to the Hebrew novel Shechet Tzavot, The Two Extremes, described by literary historian Yosef Klausner as the first significant novel in the Hebrew language. It was written by Reuben Braudes and published in 1888. Now here we find a series of interlinked tales at whose core is the story of a wealthy young chassid who comes to Odessa and without so much as reading a line of a serious book, he does dip into a few poems and stories of romances, he is transformed. True, he manages to teach himself how to read music to play a flute, but this is his closest brush with high culture. Braudes intends for us to see Chassid Yaakov Petzron's transformation as a tale of cultural change gone wrong. Indeed, at the novel's end, he is saved, rendered suitably modern, by a Vilna Jew, rescued from rudderless change characteristic of Odessa, devoid of its requisite intellectual underpinnings. Of the very few unequivocal heroes in this book, Jews of moderate appetite with healthy respect for modernity as well as tradition, nearly all come from Vilna. They attempt to influence wayward souls, to travel Maskilic Vilna's chief message. Careful, cerebral, muted reform, and above all, the primacy of ideas. We first meet Hasidic protagonist Yaakov Petzron in Odessa, sitting a week after his arrival in Alexandrovsky Park, overlooking the sea, looking out at the water and contemplating its power and mystery. Quote, "A precious sight, a very lovely sight. Here he saw beauty face to face. Here splendor and order met. Loveliness and regimen joined together. It brought his soul down to the very depths and made his heart throb. The beauty of the city was beyond estimation." End quote. In what is a rather rambling novel, Yaakov himself really doesn't move much from beyond this point. True, he leaves the seaside perch, and we follow him into middle-class drawing rooms, and with particular frequency to the home of the merchant Achitov, whose daughter Lisa wins his heart. Emotionally, though, Yaakov is fixed throughout the novel at much the point we first encounter him. He is, in fact, a remarkably passive fellow, and is brought in tow to place after place by his attorney Yurav. I think it's a play on Yurav Mendevat, the infamous biblical king, and a term that comes to be used in Hebrew for someone who sins and makes others sin. He is the novel's true villain. Yurav takes him to cabarets and bars, as well as the middle-class salons, and it is there, not in the time-honored, canonized Maskilic routine that begins cultural modernization with the reading of Moses Mendelssohn, Spinoza, or Moshe Lev Lilienblum. It is in such rooms, not in libraries, that Yaakov is made over. Quote, "His faith died a painless death, without any battle, without anguish of heart and soul." End quote. Yaakov is taken early in the novel to the concert hall, but we aren't told what he hears. The joy is simply in sitting in the marvelous room with Sarim and Savants, with male and female dignitaries or nobility, and close to his beloved Lisa. He spends his waking hours wandering streets and parks in search of Lisa. The characters in the novel, the males especially, rarely seem to sleep a full night, with the least stressful encounter followed by bouts of sleeplessness. Lisa herself is a rather unexceptional soul, manipulative, fickle, without, it seems, much affection for Yaakov. She comes alive mostly in Yaakov's fervid, insomnia-inspired mind. Much here is abstraction, especially love. Quote, love for a girl, a new word and a new feeling. Had there not been a word, there couldn't be a feeling. A new word and a new feeling for Yaakov, a feeling he had never known before today, nor had he ever heard the word until now. End quote. He learns about love from books. The only books he reads during his stay in Odessa are romances. In a splendid subversion of a Jewish Enlightenment motif, it is Vinol Yurav who plies Yaakov's literature, cheap, dime-store type novels that corrupt his soul. Braudes, an innovative novelist, is aware of what he is doing when he has the manipulative cad, Yurav, lead Yaakov to the only books he reads in Odessa. This bout of reading follows in the wake of a motivational speech of Yurav's, where he insists in mock Maskilic fashion that his Hasidic friend must broaden his horizons of literature. It is tawdry books that reshape his vocabulary and behavior as an alternate Shulchan Aruch of sorts, setting down specifications for behavior and speech alike. There are still worse problems in paradise. Yaakov, who has posed since coming here as a childless widow, is actually a married man, with children back home in his native townlet, Sukkot. Eventually, he's found out. Yurav presses him to divorce his wife and to marry Lisa, whose father, a client of Yurav's, threatened with bankruptcy, would be saved by a rich son-in-law. This is why Yurav has been plying the Chassid with romance literature, to excite him with the promise of love, so that he throws his family overboard for Lisa. The plot thickens further when Lisa's brother arranges, for reasons unconnected with Yaakov's stay in Odessa, to have himself by the frivolities of life in Odessa, and especially by his empty, self-seeking wife. There, in Sukkot, he is moved by the dignity of Jewish ritual practice, of which he knows precious little, it seems. And he is overwhelmed, quite literally, by the quite literally unvarnished beauty of Sukkot's women. In contrast to Yaakov's time in Odessa, which begins at the seashore, we first meet Shlomo in Sukkot at the Sabbath table. Here again, the telling feature of this text is its examination of the differences in Jewish space in big city and townland, as determined by where the journey starts. Shlomo promptly falls in love with a commendable young woman in Sukkot, Shifra, who was the sister-in-law of Yaakov. Shlomo encounters and, of course, is appalled by the fanaticism of the place, but he dallies, unwilling to take up again his old life in Odessa. Yaakov remains in Odessa, where eventually he learns that the city's glitter hides an ugly, rapacious side. And in the end, the decorously enlightened Vilna Jew, a long-lost relative, sets everyone on course. He even teaches Yaakov's Hasidic wife proper grooming techniques, whereupon she dazzles her ever-impressionable husband when she sweeps the town. This is, as the title warns us, a study in extremes, Odessa and Sukkot. Liza's brother Shlomo and the erstwhile Hasid Yaakov. Liza and the modest literate Shifra, with whom Shlomo falls in love in Sukkot. In the midst of this chaos, long-lost relatives surface to reclaim progeny. Errant brothers and wives are reconciled. Odessa comes to be seen by Yaakov as the frivolous place we always knew it to be, and the novel ends with the promise of reconciliation between the otherwise jagged sides of Jewish life. Odessa here is, by and large, a place that tears people apart. It turns monsters like Yurov loose to corrupt the weak and impressionable. It bewitches Yaakov into thinking he has found happiness. It promises easy pleasure and riches. It persuades the naive and incredulous that its physical beauty represents something profound. In Sukkot, the benighted place, there is still the Sabbath. In Odessa, there are cheap thrills, momentary pleasures, sensuous, startling glimpses of sea or urban paradise that yield little beyond themselves. When many years ago, I first read Stroum, it helped shape my impression that in writing about this city, it was essential to employ different analytic tools than might be true for other East European Jewish communities. Thus, one would avoid an exaggerated reliance on the influence of books, intellectuals, self-conscious cultural production. I remain convinced that this is true. A history of Odessa with intellectuals at the center, in other words, told in terms of an intimate reciprocity between intellectual production and eager Jewish milieu of the sort we are told existed in Vilna, this would distort local cultural history and the role intellectuals play. The place of Jewish intellectuals in the shaping of local cultural life was marginal, and this marginality must be seen as a part of the city's Jewish story. Consequently, or so I then assumed, I used Maskilic sources, Jewish Enlightenment sources, in order to unsettle their assumptions about the city and what it represented in modern Jewish life. The story of the intellectuals themselves was an epiphenomenon in a historical analysis whose trajectory began elsewhere, in the grain casino, so to speak, rather than in the study. This is how I understood until recently the intention of my work, an attempt to tease out of mostly Maskilic texts what could be learned about the city's economic and social life, its high as well as its popular culture. It was sitting 2 years ago in the State Archives in Odessa, housed in what was, until the 1920s, the once prestigious Rhoden Synagogue, whose history I was the first to reconstruct, that I recognized rather vaguely initially that I had not been altogether frank with myself about what most interested me about this city. I I sat in the archives, surrounded by far more archival material on Odessa Jews than could be absorbed in 10 lifetimes. The banking records of its wealthiest Jews, the transcripts of its Jewish organizational meetings, commercial records dating back to the immigration of several hundred Jewish merchants from Galicia in the 1820s, who had a considerable commercial as well as cultural impact on Jewish life. Police reports describing the daily routine, not surprisingly rather mundane, of physician and proto-Zionist leader Leon Pinsker. It was now, I realized, handling material suddenly and easily accessible to me, that much of what was in my possession did not provide me with the sort of knowledge that had sustained my interest in the city over the years. Here again, we return to matters of origin, how a story is shaped by the way it begins. It now became clear to me that my fascination with Odessa was prompted and remained focused still, oddly enough, on the same intellectuals whose shadings of cultural reality, whose artifacts I had reviewed in the past, are so, I thought, mostly for reasons of utility. I have relied primarily on their sources because I assumed so little else was available on which to base an assessment of life in this city. It now became clear to me, once the Russian archival material I had sought for years was readily accessible, that what intrigued me most about the city was the relationship that intellectuals had with it. For years, this awkward, unsettling relationship had provided me, as I now see it, with a metaphor of something much larger for the often tortuous relationship in contemporary Jewish life between the producers of ideas and the larger community of Jews. Odessa was for me, above all, a splendid prison through which to study a poignant and culturally crucial relationship in modern Jewish life. And to the extent to which I might now use newly available archival material on the city, this would probably be to explicate much the same historical problems in terms, say, of the relationship between female intellectuals and the larger Jewish sphere. Otherwise, the city, beautiful and splendid though it was, held little compelling fascination for me. In other words, I had long believed that my goal as a historian, difficult as this was without access to archives, was to tell the story of Odessa Jews from its center, from the vantage point of its merchants, its business community, its sturdy, well-funded institutions, its confident, acculturated Jews. But I now see what most intrigued me all along was life at its margins. The city as seen through the eyes of its musculate newcomers, young men from the provinces, to recycle Lionel Trilling's still suggestive phrase, with newly accessible archives providing much about, I suspect, about their female counterparts, who come to the city with grand expectations, and who are disappointed in the worst of ways, not by fanatics, or rather tepid, unpowerful lot here, whose familiar attentions would in any event have been flattering. Rather, our maskil, our enlightened Jew, encounters the terrible, numbing sensation of being rendered irrelevant. With few interested readers, true publishing houses exist here that release Judaica books that were on the whole unread locally. A communal establishment neither shocked nor, for that matter, much interested. And perhaps most hurtful, modern progressive youth who looked right past it. Here, in a place that was the most modern in Russian Jewry, or so they had come to believe, masculine intellectuals found that they had, within the span of a short train ride of a day or two, passed from small-town notoriety to irrelevance. Back home, they were the worst of transgressors. Now, in a place where there were publishers, jobs, schools, even freedom from hecklers, here there was little apparent need for them. The stuff of tragedy. A grim signpost in contemporary Jewish life. The trade puzzle, that forbidden book so dangerous and enticing elsewhere, no longer threatens here. This is because scholars, whether traditional or modern, no longer intimidate. Isn't there something unsettling in this, if only in its familiarity? Odessa Jewry's story, as I now recognize I've been inclined to tell it, begins neither at the commercial exchange nor at the port, not even in the city itself, but on the train. I begin with the passenger, a young Maskil, an erudite lapsed Misnagid or Chassid, a peripatetic youth from Lithuania or Ukraine. Yaakov Fichtman writes of his own journey, quote, I stood nearly the entire night beside an open train carriage window, breathing the fragrance of the dark, vast southern steppe, end quote. He comes from a primitive place, with few good books, some camaraderie, much darkness. He sits barely able to contain himself because he is on his way to Odessa. The train trip is a crucial part of his spiritual journey, as recalled in memoirs written later. It is almost always the longest distance he has traveled. It offers him his first sense of the world's immensity, of his life as an unfolding adventure, and the prospect of a real distance from the battlefields of his adolescence. He will soon see the Black Sea. Still more exciting, he will be near, or so he hopes, the wise men of Odessa, the so-called Chochmei Odessa, those arbiters of good taste, culture, and politics. He imagines himself sitting at Bialik's table, in a Hara'am sitting room, holding in his hand the galleys of his own articles or poetry, praised by giants. He feels joy, fear, ambition, overpowering expectation. He steps off the train into the night air smelling of greenery. It is young, Jewishly preoccupied intellectuals like Fichtman, hungry to escape and no less eager for an embrace from the world of their fathers and mothers. Intellectuals who rush off to Odessa from their parental homes as angry rebels, and once here, adopt readily the designation of Mendele as their grandfather, or Sholem Aleichem, or for that matter, Hara'am as their father. Such ambivalent, ambiguous modernists have been for many years my main interest. This is what led me to write recently about Hara'am. Odessa fascinates me as a background to these lives, as a setting for an extraordinary and ironic encounter. Here they come fleeing the shackles of small-town Jewish life with a sense of urgency to do their part in creating a new understanding of Judaism in modernity. They produce much of their best work here, in a place that inspires and also horrifies them. There's a moment in the late 1880s and early 90s when an unusually talented group of transitional or maskilic intellectuals, writers mostly of Hebrew or Yiddish, eager to leave their mark on Jewish life, arrive in Odessa. They're a small group of young men at the circle, at the core. One woman belongs to this inner core, Maria Sacker, who I mentioned last week, of no more than about 20 intellectuals who quickly set themselves apart from those they designate as their inferiors and whom they manage effectively to write out of history. Later, when they and their literary heirs reconstruct the Russian Jewish past, once they resettled in post-World War I Berlin, Tel Aviv, and elsewhere, they would recall Mendele and his circle as situated at the time at the center of local Jewish cultural life. Beginning in the 1920s, once the collected works of Mendele and other writers in this literary stable were codified, it was this collective memory of what transpired here, along, ironically, with sweeping denunciations of the city, that was imposed on 20th century Jewry. And in the absence of a culturally active Russian Jewry in the Soviet Union, these would remain on the whole uncontested. When we look at the circle in Odessa at their prime, however, we find intellectual pioneers with the saddest of voices. Dubno, an often shrewd observer and a much better journalist than historian, by the way, saw this when he reviewed in a well-known article an early publicistic venture of this group, the journal Kaveret of the late 1880s. In Kaveret and elsewhere, the circle communicated the sense that as crucial as their tasks were, and they saw themselves as doing little less than reconstructing a now threatened Jewish civilization, they would probably fail. The reasons for their pessimism had little to do with anti-Semitism per se. Countervailing cultural forces in the West, as well as Russia, were simply too powerful, and the pull of the larger world too strong. This response is more than merely idiosyncratic. It is not merely that Bialik resisted the crown of the national poet, which of course he assiduously courted as well, that Aharaam's impressions got the better of him, or that Mendele resented all political camps and designations and poked fun at everyone. Rather, their pessimism was something of a cultural trademark, a defining feature of the time and their response to it. Their ideologies, among the most influential in 20th century Jewish life, were conceived against this backdrop of abiding loss. Like Levinsky, who admits he cannot help but return to the site of that once empty private lending library and look in at a now garrulous crowd inside, a scene, as he describes it, of loneliness and embarrassment, I too find the marginality of intellectuals here a cruel source of fascination. In a place that they had fully expected to conquer, they lived as something of a colony, spying on street corner performers, on clowns, whose impact on local Jewry as they understood it was more decisive than theirs because of how these performers managed to transmute Jewish culture into something both vague and surprisingly facile. Lonely now for the first time in their lives, or so they often assert, these intellectuals evoke a longing of their own for the self-contained Jewish town, where they were once shunned, persecuted, and also important. The sadness in their writings is inspired by how what they left behind looks from their new, painfully marginal urban perch. Not that they can forget altogether the bite of small-town fanaticism. Still, its veneration for those who wrote, its respect for those who read, is all the more apparent to them now that they sense that it might well prove impossible in Odessa to construct a credible, modernized version of Judaism which would prove sufficiently sturdy to sustain the burden. Aharaam gave the impression publicly of austere, almost eerie self-confidence. Yet take a look at one of his first pieces, written in this same volume, Kaveret, before his famous essay, This Is Not the Way. This semi-autobiographical piece is an elegy. I quote, "What am I now? A maskil? I cannot say that with certainty. Still now, in the moments before the end of the Sabbath, between the time that the sun sets and one begins lighting candles once again, I love to sit in a corner in the dark and examine the range of my feelings. In such moments, I feel my soul rising heavenward, as if my spiritual elation has emerged from within me to the sound of heavenly voices, and I recall various memories of my youth, memories that make me laugh, pleasant recollections. Sometimes my lips will open as if by themselves, and I find myself chanting some well-known melody in a hushed voice. During those long winter evenings, at times when I'm sitting in the company of enlightened men and women, sitting at a table with tray food and cards, and my heart is glad and my face bright, suddenly then, I don't know how this happens, suddenly before me is a very old table with broken legs, full of tattered books, torn and dusty books of genuine value, and I'm sitting alone in their midst, reading them by the light of a dim candle, opening up one and closing another, not even bothering to look at their tiny print, and the whole world is like a garden of Eden. End quote. The table is broken. The books dusty, tattered. His joy in reading them incomparable. He imagines the scene with fierce longing, because there is, of course, now an unbridgeable distance between him and the world, and that world which he can never re-enter, nor, for that matter, would he wish to. Still, the vacuous scene in which he now finds himself, with its drink, cards, a hint of promiscuity, is contrasted with his base medrash, this idyll. Past and also present are reconfigured. The distance between books sacred and profound collapsed. Having seen what Odessa has wrought, he imagines a conservative utopia, a return to a time when joy was in study, when authority was in the hands of those who best read texts, when the boundaries of what was and wasn't Jewish were, or at least appeared to be, self-evident. Quote, just wait until now becomes then. You'll see how happy we were, end quote, writes Susan Sontag. Many of the same Chochmei Odessa, wise men like Dizengoff, Karaam, Rupnitsky, would later seek to impose much the same vision and create from scratch in the sand dunes near ancient Jaffa, a city inspired both by what Odessa was and, more importantly, by what it was not, a seaside utopia, a homogeneously Jewish but, as they saw it, liberal kingdom, with its emblem of literacy, its gymnasium at the center of the town. This elite school was at its topographical and ideological center, as the earliest maps of this suburb show. Ahada'am, the moral philosopher of a reconstructed bourgeois secular Jewishness, was placed in a house around the corner from the school, in what was to be a world of comfortable burghers and literate urban Jews. This Mediterranean Hampstead Garden suburb was, of course, quickly transformed in the mid-1920s by tens of thousands of Jews, mostly small shopkeepers and artisans from Poland, who built a nervous, vibrant town that, without premeditation, shunted aside the plans of its intellectual founders. The city grew, the gymnasium stuck in one of its now remote corners, the building later was leveled, a Hebrew-speaking culture of a different sort emerged. Quote, yet writing what you know has nothing to do with security. What is more dangerous? End quote, asks Eudora Welty. Writing at the margins, I gain sustenance from those in the past whose frustrations and achievements, whose limitations and biases, whose relationship to community and work help me contextualize my own. Quote, forget for a while that you've got spectacles on your nose and autumn in your soul. Stop raising hell at your desk and stammering in public, end quote. So instructs Isaac Babel's Aryeh Lev, musing on the Odessa cemetery wall, telling of the life of that noble savage Ben Yakrik. Those unable to follow this impossible dictum, ironic fare that Babel himself was far from sure ought to be followed, sit scribbling, as he himself did, writing